So are tips or gratuities taxable? It's a good question. The answer is it depends. That's always the answer, sorry. But in this video, I'm just going to get a little more into detail on whether or not tips are taxable from a Canadian perspective. And I'm going to refer to the Canada Revenue Agency website. But tips, of course, I think everyone knows what those are, especially they're common in restaurants where you might pay, let's say $20 for a meal, and then maybe you leave a 10, 15, or 20, 25% tip for the server. So that's kind of a gratuity or extra money given to the service provider on top of the cost of the actual product or service that they're providing you. And so whether or not those are taxable depends, and depends what perspective you're looking for. So in that case where, let's say I went to a restaurant, my meal was $25 and I left $30. In that case, I'm leaving a $5 tip. Now, is that taxable? How is that treated? Yes, it's going to be taxable, but who has to claim it? It kind of depends on how it's set up. So if the restaurant is running that tip through their POS system and recording it, then it kind of becomes revenue for the business. And then it depends on what they do with that. Do they just kind of hold it and then give it all to that server? In that case, then it's more just like money they're giving to the server, and then the server has to claim it. Whereas if I was just to pay that server, let's say $25 with my credit card and then leave $5 in cash, and the server just took that $5 cash and pocketed it and didn't run it through the restaurant system, the restaurant maybe doesn't even know about it. So it's not something they're going to be claiming. But either way, if the server is eventually receiving some of that money or all of that money, then what they receive is taxable. And now if the restaurant receives that money, are they keeping some of it or are they giving it all out? Because if they're giving it all out, then it's, they haven't really collected money that they're holding that they need to claim tax on. Whereas if they say, give 80% of that tip to the server and keep the other 20%, then they actually have taxable income. So I'm just going to read directly from the CRA website here regarding tips and if they are taxable. So it says tips and gratuities that employees receive are considered income earned in respect of employment for purposes of the Income Tax Act. However, you must determine whether tips received during employment are considered pensionable earnings under the CPP, which is Canada Pension Plan, or whether they are insurable earnings under the Employment Insurance Act, or both. The answer depends on whether the tips are considered to have been paid by the employer, controlled tips, whether they are considered to have been paid by the client, direct tips, or whether they are declared in the province of Quebec. The term controlled tips refers to tips that an employer controls or possesses and then must pay to the employee. The following are some examples of controlled tips. The employer adds a mandatory service charge to a client's bill to cover tips. The employer adds a percentage to a client's bill to cover tips. Tips that are allocated to employees using a tip share formula determined by the employer. Tips that an employer includes in his business income, then expenses and redistributes to employees in the form of pay. Tips that the employees turn over to their employer, who then distributes them to the employees. Or cash tips that are deposited into the employer's bank account and become or even commingled with the property of the employer and then paid out to the employees. Now for direct tips, it says direct tips are paid directly by the customer to the employee. The employer has no control over the tip amount or its distribution. The employer is merely a conduit for the tip from the customer to the employee. The following are some examples of direct tips. A customer leaves money on the table at the end of a meal and the server keeps the whole amount. A guest gives a tip directly to a bellhop, door person, car attendant, porter, etc. The employees and not the employer decide how the tips are pooled or shared among employees. A customer includes an amount for a tip when paying the bill by credit or debit card, and the employer returns the tip amount in cash to the employee at the end of the shift. In exceptional situations, the cash tips could be paid out the day after, for example, if there was not enough available cash on hand. So there you go, that's directly from the CRA. So it kind of depends on the situation as to how the tips are paid out. Either way, whether that's the business that's having to claim some of the tips for income tax and also the employees having to claim some, or whether that's, those direct tips that are going directly to the employee and then they're just claiming it all. Either way, tips in general for business activity are taxable income. It just kind of depends on whether the business is claiming some or all, or the employee is claiming some or all, depending on those situations. So hopefully this video was helpful. Hopefully it wasn't too confusing. I will leave the link to that CRA website in the video description below. And if you want to check out my YouTube channel, I have over 165 videos that cover business management and business startup topics.